Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I was just saying that today's weather is probably my favorite type of weather. It's a fall day. I am a fall baby. It's that crisp, beautiful morning with the sun shining. So happy to see everyone out for our last lecture in this series on Canadian identity. We will start this off in a good way if Cassie can lead us in the land acknowledgement.
We respectfully acknowledge the southern watershed of Manadowitsa-Gayagan,
Spirit Lake,
Georgian Bay and Wayaseagning,
Shining Lake,
Simcoe, and centrally Lake Couchiching waters, and lands that have historically sustained the lives of Wendat and Anishinaabeg, including the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabe, and centrally Rama First Nation, the keepers of the Minjikaning fishing weirs.
These sacred lands and waterways are recognized in the Robinson-Huron Treaty, Williams Treaties, and J. Collins Land Purchase. Recognizing all nations gathered and living here today from across Turtle Island, including Haudenosaunee, Métis, and Inuit peoples.
Thank you. Yesterday we were taking down the teepee, which is quite a landmark on the Orillia campus of Lakehead University. So as a team we come together and we put the teepee up every spring with elders guiding the process. And then yesterday was the day that we dismantled it and stored the pieces of it in our storage. Afterwards we tended to the Indigenous garden, and with some guidance we talked about, we did some harvesting of tobacco and harvesting of sweetgrass and sage. And we talked about the importance of not taking more than you need so that we can keep our planet sustainable and growing, and we are getting what we need from the earth, but making sure that it's reciprocal. And so it reminded me of the lecture last week that we held on campus, part of this series, but also launching the President's 60th anniversary lecture series for Lakehead University. And there we had Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskimos sharing a little bit about repatriation and reconciliation, and she shared something that rang home with Lee and I. We were talking about it this morning, referring to the planet as one dish, and this comes from the one dish, one spoon story from Indigenous tales, where the earth is represented by a dish and the spoon represents the inhabitants of earth, and it just sends that message of making sure that we make sure that dish stays full. We only have one dish, of course, and making sure that we are only taking what we need. So I try to, again, think about that when I'm purchasing things, when I'm taking things from the land, and making sure that we're leaving some for the people that come after us. So without further ado, and just before we do get into the lecture, the Reverend at St. Paul's this morning chatted with me, and they are doing a community project, and I wanted to share that with you. So they are making origami doves of peace, and the materials for this are just outside of that door. If you're interested in artistic, they would love to have community help with making the origami doves, and you can just drop them off in the tray there. They'll be displaying them on a tree for Remembrance Day as a sign of peace, and then moving into the Christmas season, they'll be giving them away as ornaments. So if you'd like to participate in that project, please feel free to take one or some of the materials. Looking up the instructions on YouTube can also help for those of you that, like me, that might need a bit more of a guided direction. In terms of the President's Lecture Series as well, you should have in your inboxes the initial communications sent out by our communications team about the 3 first series. So our next one is located in Thunder Bay, in person on campus, but also is being live streamed for those of us that can't be in person. So do look for that email. If you haven't received it, we will be sending them out to those of you that are on our email list, and if you wish to be part of that list, just be sure to reach out to me, and I'll make sure that you receive that communication so you can register. It is a free series, and then we'll be revisiting the series with our 3rd speaker here in Orillia in January, so look for those notifications. And now, without further ado, because I did give some further ado, I would like to introduce MC, our lovely committee member from TAL. Thank you so much, everyone.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As always, we want to welcome our viewers who are joining us online. Our virtual audience continues to grow, and we thank you for spending part of your day with us. We hope that everyone has enjoyed the series. For our final lecture of the series, we are pleased to welcome Elsa Pierzig. Elsa is an assistant professor in the political science department at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. We are so fortunate to have her here in Orillia to share her expertise with us. She is going to address parliamentary democracy, and we will learn about the inner workings of the confidence relationships and the constitutional conventions of responsible government in Canada. So I think we're going to learn a great deal today, and thank you for coming all the way from Thunder Bay to share your expertise with us. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Elsa Pierzig.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. Oh, am I not on? Oh, I think I'm on now. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you here in Orillia, all the way from Thunder Bay, but I also live in Ottawa right now. So we haven't yet moved to Thunder Bay, so a lot of travel for me, but I'm excited to be here and talk with you today about the confidence relationship. And this talk is predominantly built off of my PhD research. This is the Canadian-ish part of it. I study both Canadian and comparative politics, so I study parliamentary systems broadly. And for my work, before I got into the comparative, looking at 28 different parliamentary democracies, I started in Canada. I'm naturally a Canadianist, and I started with 2008. And the parliamentary or constitutional crisis of 2008, right? So in 2008, for a refresher, there was an early election. There had been, the Harper government had passed fixed date election. They went for an early election barely 2 years after the 2006 election. There was little change in the results, and they stayed with a minority government. Storm clouds were emerging on the economic front, and at the same time, for reasons that no one's fully sure about, the Harper government decided that they were going to axe the, I don't want to say axe the tax, but there were per vote subsidies that were paid out to political parties. You know, every vote that they got, they'd get a subsidy. And that's still the case in Ontario, but federally, the Harper government decided to end that. That and the fact that the government didn't seem interested in thinking about what to do when the recession hits led to a bit of a revolt in the opposition parties in Parliament. And so the NDP and the Liberals got together, signed a coalition deal. They got the Bloc Québécois on board. The Bloc Québécois agreed to a confidence and supply agreement. So every time it looks like the government needs to get support to survive in office, the Bloc promised support the NDP and Liberal coalition for 2 years. But that, of course, didn't happen. There was an upcoming opposition day. The Liberals and the NDP announced that they would table a non-confidence vote. And that would happen, and then the government, with their numbers, would be able to, well, would fall, so it'd be defeated. And that would allow, because confidence would be transferred from the Harper government to the coalition, to take office. The Harper government didn't want to see this happen, so they asked the Governor General to prorogue Parliament. And what that meant was Parliament was effectively shut down in order to avoid Parliament expressing its will, which, because the prorogation was used to avoid a non-confidence vote, gets into this, what's the relationship between the two? And how much power does Parliament have? And can Parliament truly hold government accountable? And so, what it does is it questions this fundamental role of Parliament, Parliament's ability to hold government accountable. And also its ability to break government, but also its ability to make government if it's unhappy with the current government, because that's the way parliamentary democracy works. So prorogation was being used to circumvent Parliament's ability to take action. And part of this was because the Harper government argued that why entrust a coalition when, yes, in fact, it looked like the economy was going to take a downturn. And also, the Bloc Québécois, being a separatist party, you can't really trust them to support the government. So this argument was used to say, no, we can't try this coalition experiment. We need to keep the Conservatives in power because they have the largest number of seats in Parliament, so they should form government. So, at this point, I want to take a step back and talk about the fundamental roles that Parliament has, or has in theory. So these fundamental rules are from Frank's 1987, and he published in 1987 a seminal work on the Parliament of Canada, and he's got 4 fundamental roles for us. So the first is to make a government. There's an election, it returns a House, and the House of Commons is where the government is drawn from. Ministers come out of the House of Commons. So Parliament has a role to make sure that there's a government. And then it has to make government work. And that means providing the government with funds through the budget process, or working to pass legislation. Then it has to make government behave. So that's why you have question period, scrutinizing legislation, the committees scrutinize departments, making sure that there's some daily accountability. And then, finally, if things are going poorly, you can break the government and make a new one. The idea being that you can do this without going to a new election. So, the 2008 parliamentary crisis then asks us, can Parliament still break and make a new government? So, to consider this, we need to look at the different confidence testing mechanisms between Parliament and Cabinet. So we can look at things like non-confidence votes, confidence votes, dissolution rules, and in other words, all of these connectors, the things that test confidence between them. And so what I've done is I have broken my research down into 2 guiding questions. The first is, what are the rules that structure the confidence connection between Parliament and the Prime Minister? So how do those rules work? What's in the rules? And then, is there a gap between what the rules say and what happens in practice? So is there a gap between the theory and the interpretation? Of course, you're probably asking, why should we care? I want to address that. After all, if we go back to the 2008 example that I started with, in 2008, there was an election. The party that got the most seats was the Conservatives. You could say Canadians elected a government. And so, if the government seems to fail, then you can just go to a new election, get a new government. What's the problem? Or you could say that the 2008 events, those were just rare. Most of the time we have majority governments, or things seem to be relatively stable. So if this is just a blip in the system, then again, why does it really matter? And often if you do have majority governments, then there is no non-confidence votes at all. So there are always confidence votes. Non-confidence, no, but confidence votes, yes. Because budgets are always confidence votes. So why should we care? So at a basic level, I want to push back against this because of the way that parliamentary democracy is supposed to work in theory. And so for parliamentary to work, we can conceptualize it as this chain of delegation and accountability. That's how it's been framed now in the comparative literature to try and connect from voters all the way to bureaucracy. So what this chain is, from voters to parliament to cabinet to the bureaucracy, is a chain made up of 3 key links. The first one is between voters and parliament, right? So elections, in an election you either choose parliament, or you can hold MPs accountable if you don't like the ones, how they worked in the previous parliament, you can select a new one. Then you have between parliament and parliament and cabinet, so your confidence connections as well, like that a speech from the throne would be the first one after a new parliament. So then the speech from the throne is in the Senate, and then it goes to Parliament to the House of Commons for the address and reply. And the vote on the address and reply is like a vote sanctioning the government, that the government does in fact have confidence. Budget votes, as I mentioned, are confidence votes, or anything the government really wants to pass, says it's essential to our agenda. That is a confidence vote. And then there are the non-confidence votes, and there's dissolution as well. I'll remind you of all of those, because they're really important. But anyhow, and then there's the cabinet to the bureaucracy as that third link in the chain. For today, we're focused on parliament to cabinet, but for a parliamentary democracy to work, at the end of the day, cabinet also has to delegate to civil servants, so that civil servants will help with policy development and policy implementation. So importantly, with this chain, delegation goes up. So voters delegate to parliament, parliament delegates to cabinet, cabinet delegates to the bureaucracy, and then accountability goes down. So cabinet will hold their ministers hold their civil servants in the department accountable for the work that they do. Parliament holds cabinet accountable for the work that it does, and voters then hold parliament accountable. So let's circle back to those 4 fundamental roles that Franks has identified for parliament. And that kind of flushes out what happens in this second link that I'm focusing between parliament and cabinet. So the first is make government. That happens in that link. Then you have make government work, also happening. Those are, the budget votes, etc. Make government behave, and to break and make a new government. So all of those roles fall in that second link. So my question then is, what if Parliament has, what if the rules that structure that link between Parliament and Cabinet, what if the structure of those rules or the interpretation of those rules makes it difficult for Parliament to deliver on that fourth role of breaking and making a new government? Because what it does is it takes away that, if the rules are structured, or the interpretation of those rules is structured to take that away, then you're interrupting the accountability, the way accountability flows in this chain from voters to the bureaucracy. So in other words, it's disrupting that accountability. You've got accountability going from the Prime Minister and cabinet to the bureaucracy, and you've got accountability at election time from voters to Parliament, but you're breaking the chain in that Prime Minister to Parliament relationship, cabinet to Parliament. It's interrupting that chain of accountability. And that then makes it hard for Parliament to also transfer confidence to a new government in the midterm, which is during the parliamentary term, and that being fundamental to how parliamentary democracy is supposed to work in theory. And so if I go back to my questions that I started my research with, what are the rules that structure the confidence connection between Parliament and Cabinet, so looking at what the rules are, and then is there a gap in the theory and practice of the rules? And I'm going to start with that first question. What are those rules structuring the relationship? So, to answer that, this is where I developed this idea of the confidence relationship. If we think about parliamentary democracy as this chain of democratic delegation and accountability, then that confidence relationship is what fills out that second link from from the House of Commons, Parliament, to the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Generally, the way this connection between Cabinet and Parliament, generally the way it's studied and talked about, we'll talk about each of the individual components separately. So it will talk about the investiture, how you get the government. It will talk about confidence votes. People will research, I'm just going to talk about confidence votes, and that's it. Or people will talk about non-confidence votes. Fine. And people will talk about dissolution. How do we end the parliamentary term? What people aren't really looking at is how all of those rules add up to shape the relationship. And choices made with one rule will impact how the other rule works. So if we take a step back from Canada, then we think about another country, Germany. Let's just go with Germany. So Germany, Parliament actually gets to vote before Cabinet actually gets appointed. They get to vote on it beforehand. So that gives Parliament more of a say in that making of government. And then, because there's more of a say in the making of government, the way they've structured their non-confidence vote is they've actually made it a lot harder than how ours works. Here, whenever there's an opposition day or an amendment, even to, say, legislation, you could tie in, this House has no confidence in the government of the day. But in Germany, it's a little tougher because you need to also say this House has no confidence in the government of the day, and we think so-and-so should form the new government. So it both defeats and selects a new person at the same time, which is really hard to get agreement on, so very hard to use. But the point of this, and then they also add in fixed term elections, so Parliament sits for 4 years, unless there's one exception to the rule, which is a defeat on a confidence vote, but otherwise, no exception, you're going to sit the full 4 years. So the rules are connected, and constitutions, the way they've been constructed, when they emphasize one rule, they'll maybe de-emphasize another one. And so my thing is, well, why aren't we looking at all of these together? Because they all relate to each other and connect Parliament to Cabinet. So I'm really interested in these horizontal linkages that's connecting all of these, and thinking about this confidence connection, what I'm calling the confidence relationship as a whole. And so you could basically boil it down to a math equation, and the confidence relationship is the rules for investiture votes plus the rules for confidence votes plus the rules for non-confidence, dissolution rules, and also a set of rules that I'm calling the relevant procedural and constitutional rules. So some other parliamentary systems, well, parliamentary systems are divided on whether they have ministers retain their seats in the House of Commons. So in Canada, you turn on question period and you see the ministers in the House answering questions. But in other countries, MPs, in order to get into cabinet, may have to give up their seat in the legislature. And then they would be invited into the legislature to answer questions, but they don't sit there, which means that there's now delays in how fast things can get turned around. Or some systems, they don't have fixed term rules, they might have extraordinary election rules. So basically, when you have an early election, you still have to have the regularly scheduled election. Anyways, I'm capturing those in this additional relevant procedural and constitutional rules. And together, all of those equal the confidence relationship. And the confidence relationship are the rules that structure the confidence game, you could say, between parliaments and cabinets. So what I've done is I've operationalized this idea of the confidence relationship, collected all the rules for 28 parliamentary democracies, including Canada, and come up with an index that captures overall what the strength of or weakness of those rules are. And those rules, for example, could include the majority. So all of these, well, not dissolution necessarily, but the confidence testing, so investiture votes, confidence votes, non-confidence votes, they all are votes in Parliament. So here we're used to the idea of relative majorities. Other places use absolute majorities, so there has to be a full 50% plus one of the total number of MPs in the legislature. That can make it harder to pass the vote. So I capture that. I'll capture, are there any specific requirements about the motions, or maybe requirements about the debate time or the delay? Sometimes it will be like, you can't have this vote for 2 or 5 days after when it gets introduced, that kind of stuff. There's also caps on the number of times, like how many times in a parliamentary session, which in Canada is a year, how many times can opposition parties introduce non-confidence motions. Canada used to have a cap, and that got removed a number of decades ago from the order paper, but there was that cap there. And some countries retain a cap on the number of motions. So I'm adding up all of these things to get this index that evaluates the power of Parliament to hold government responsible by extending and withdrawing confidence, and then also, with the dissolution rules, Parliament's ability to control its own fate. When will there be another election? So I'm not going to present what all the results are necessarily, and I know that this isn't particularly legible, but what is noticeable about this, so it's time, the first year of analysis, so when the country got its constitution or when it became solidly democratic, and then the scale is on the bottom of the Parliamentary Selectoral Power Index. It goes from 0 to 1. 0 is very little parliamentary selectoral power to hold the government accountable and determine its own fate, and 1 is all the power. And so what you can see here is that all the countries are clustering. despite all the different rules that are out there in the universe of rules, all the countries are kind of in the same spot. They're all clustered between 0.4 and like 0.55, with the UK, not anymore. This data is a little older. This is for the UK under Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which is now gone because it made Parliament too powerful. Anyways, so the point is that they're all, if you look at the rules as a whole, they're all clustering in this small area. So despite all those rules, all of the countries are kind of ending up at the same point. And that same point, because the average is like 0.4, 0.42, it actually means that by and large, that there's not a lot, or there's limited parliamentary selectoral power. And generally, the executive has a little bit more in the confidence relationship. So let's turn to the Canadian confidence relationship and how it measures up. So the Canadian confidence relationship is largely based in convention, which means that you can't go to the constitutional documents, the Constitution Act 1867 or the Constitution Act 1982, to help you understand. There's no mention of the Prime Minister, for example. So all of our rules that make this chain of delegation and accountability work, what we call responsible government in Canada, all those rules are based in convention that is developed out of practice, so how people practice the rules over centuries. And many of those rules, like the idea that cabinet needs to have confidence of parliament, go back to the 1700s in the UK. And it took 100 years in the UK to kind of build up the role of cabinet, and then that idea got transmitted here to Canada. And so now we write down, based on what we've seen in practice over the years, what the relevant actors understand to be the rules, and the relevant actors are the politicians and the person enforcing the rules, which in Canada is the Governor General, or the Lieutenant Governors in the provinces. And what they see to be the rules are the rules of how our Constitution work. And then ideally, the population, the voters, should also know what the rules are, because it comes to election time as the time, and public opinion polling, to kind of hold politicians accountable and say, oh no, you're not following the rules, or yes, you're following the rules, or whatnot. But to sanction if they think the politicians aren't doing the rules, following the rules, which means that also if we don't understand how the rules work, then we can erode the system as it's been designed. Or alternatively, maybe eroding is always thinking about there's a golden age of Parliament. Maybe it's just evolving. Practice is evolving and rules are changing. Okay, so generally, the way the rules are constructed in Canada tends to be a little conservative. It's very traditional, and what it does is it gives Parliament a bit of a passive role for Parliament. So it's not a constructive or active role. And what I mean by this, if we circle back to my Germany example, right? In Canada, it's just the House has no confidence in the government. So it's just saying, that's it. We don't want the government. They're not doing a good job. If the vote passes, it passes, and we'll see what happens. But the German idea of saying, no, we don't want the government, we want so-and-so to form a new government, is an active role, because it's saying, we don't want what we currently have, and we want this. So not just passively saying, oh no, we don't like this, let's see what happens, but we want to do this alternative thing. And so the rules, the way they're constructed, can either be kind of this passive, go along to get along, or they can encourage action. and giving Parliament a direct choice in what happens. And this passiveness kind of also comes out of the fact that there is this voter sanctioning. It's not outlined in the Constitution. And so, the politicians will do what they can do within the limits afforded to them by the democratic public of the day. And as Andrew heard, one of Canada's long-time scholars on constitutional convention puts it, the politicians will do what they can do within the constitutional rules that they feel still upholds this critical morality, so that what generally people think is the right decision. Okay, I understand this isn't very legible, and that isn't so important. What is important is that this is breaking down what the Canadian constitutional and confidence relationship is, and this is how I've scored it in my Parliamentary Selectoral Power Index. So I'm going to walk you through this. So for the investiture vote is the head of state nominates a candidate that nominates is not really a Canadian term, but the comparative term for it, but basically appoints a candidate that they think can hold the confidence of the House of Commons. So you see the election results. Who do we think can hold that confidence? That's the person who should be the Prime Minister. And then in turn, the Prime Minister selects a cabinet, and the cabinet then prepares its agenda, its government program for the year, and that's the speech for the throne. And so basically, because the vote is after appointment, it's ex post, after the fact, sanctioning of that make a government. Confidence votes are government initiated, and they're either explicit, so does the House have confidence in the government, or they're implied, like budget votes, and just a relative majority decision rule. So if whatever majority that is sitting there in the House of Commons defeats the motion, then it will fall, like the government will fall. Non-confidence votes are these negative motions, so the passiveness, because it's just, we don't have confidence in the government, and we'll see where confidence lies, if it lies anywhere else. And dissolution, the head of state dissolves. So the head of state has the prerogative power, reserve power of dissolution, and it's up to the Prime Minister to provide advice to the head of state, or the Governor General, to dissolve and say, let's have an election. And the head of state will generally accept that advice unless for some reason it seems like this is being done to politically exploit an advantage for the government or something. But basically, unless it looks like it's going to break the Constitution, the advice will be accepted. And then in general, on the procedural front, if you look at the standing orders in the House of Commons, the standing orders pretty much give all control over House of Commons business to the government, which generally makes it quite limited for the opposition, and also makes it a little hard for introductions of non-confidence votes, which either have to be on some sort of an amendment or an adjournment debate, or the explicit ones, you often have to wait for opposition days. All this to say, when you add up the way I've designed the coding scheme, when you add it up, you get a score of 0.4, which, if we're remembering it's a 0 to 1, 0.4 is lower on the scale, and it's also below average for all 28 parliamentary democracies. So in general, the Canadian confidence relationship doesn't reward Parliament as much as in other parliamentary democracies, at least on paper. And it also suggests that the executive has more power, if you think of it as a trade-off between Parliament and Cabinet, that Parliament is less well off relative to the executive, which is able to exert more power in the confidence relationship. In part, if you think of like dissolution, Prime Minister is advising dissolution. There's no role for Parliament. Okay, so the Canadian confidence relationship itself is relatively old. We can trace it back to the emergence of responsible government in Canada, in the colonies in the 19th century. And there are many commentators who were writing around that time, like Joseph Howe, Robert Baldwin, Alpheus Todd, who was the librarian in the province of Canada's legislature. And if you read those items, you can kind of get three key expectations out of what they thought responsible government would mean. And the first is that there's flexibility, right? These constitutional conventions based on practice, so they can evolve with time. Constitutional conventions are flexible. There's also fluidity in the confidence tests. So the government can lose confidence, but it can also regain confidence as well. It's not totally set. One vote doesn't end everything. And the third is that they wrote about Parliament's ability to do a midterm change of government. So if government lost confidence, that you could choose another government out of the existing legislature. So you could have this midterm change. So how has it been used since the adoption? Major uses of the Canadian confidence relationship, well, this is why I talked about how, or the description for this talk is about like pulling back the curtain, because the reality is that we're talking about like the ultimate ability of Parliament to hold government accountable. So it is naturally going to be a rare occurrence. By and large, the electoral system that we have, because it will generally over-reward the major political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives historically, we get a lot of majority governments. So they will get a larger proportion of the seats in the House of Commons than their percentage of the popular vote. And because of that, then you don't see the confidence relationship in action so much. So if we look at Canada, and I say 1921 because 1921 is when the Progressives entered the scene at the federal level. So prior to 1921, it was just a two-party system. The two parties got together, they would get like 90% of the vote. So you'd always have this majority government. It's not really worth thinking about prior to then. But after 1921, you have entrance of the Progressives and other parties down the line come onto the scene as well. And so it fragments Parliament, and you can start actually thinking about this responsible government, these constitutional conventions in action. An SMP is single-member plurality electoral system, which we also call first past the post here in Canada. Okay, so since 1921, there have been 13 minority governments. I guess actually we're now at 14. I didn't update that because we had an election this year. So anyhow, so 8 have faced confidence tests with a reasonable chance of success. So they could be defeated. 6 were defeated. And after that defeat, there was an early election. So the Meehan government in 1926, Diefenbaker's third cabinet, The way the comparative literature counts it is after every election, you count a new cabinet. So Meehan had been in office after the end of the Borden government, so his second time in office after King, so Meehan 2. Diefenbaker's third in his string there. Trudeau's third in his string. Clark's government, Martin took office before the election, like after Chrétien resigned, and then there was an election, and then a new one in 2004. So his second was defeated, and then the Harper, it was defeated in November, and then the Harper government was also defeated. And 2, so 8 have faced confidence tests, so 6 have been defeated, 2 regained confidence. So the Pearson government lost a vote on some tax legislation. That's like budget legislation, so that was a confidence. So the Pearson government negotiated for like a week with the opposition, got the NDP to get on board and support the government, and the government regained confidence. Martin's government did that as well in May of 2007. No, what am I saying? 2005. And this was the crossing of the floor of like Belinda Stronach, and the fact that they did some negotiation again, and they had lost a vote on an amendment in the budget, and then they were able to pass the budget, so they regained confidence. One midterm government transition, the King government, the second King cabinet ended in 1926, which is how Meehan took his second government, because the Governor General took King's resignation and said, let's invite Meehan to form a government. And so that was the one midterm government transition that Canada has experienced since 1921. And then the Meehan government promptly fell as well, because rumor has it that back in the day they paired votes because of travel. So some MPs were away from the House, and one MP had agreed to pair off, so basically not vote, because that would interfere with the opposition government balance in the House of Commons, so they promised not to vote. But the rumor is that they woke up suddenly during debate and then voted, and they brought down the government. And 4 of those 13 minority cabinets were dissolved early. So the Prime Minister said, things aren't working as we expected in the House of Commons. Governor General, can you dissolve Parliament for us? So what I've done is I've looked at these uses of the Confidence Convention, and I do this with this David E. Smith's sort of theories of democracy and contention, looking at the parliamentary theory of democracy and looking at the electoral theory of democracy. And sort of parliamentary theory being this very traditional, that chain of delegation and accountability, whereas electoral democracy is seeing, we vote for parliament, but in that we're really voting for who the prime minister is, so we expect a direct relationship, and the party with the most seats, that should form the government, and the confidence relationship doesn't really matter at all. Yes, anyways, that doesn't matter. So what I do is I think about these 3 expectations that people had written about in the 19th century about what they thought the confidence relationship should look like in Canada, and how does it measure up in terms of parliamentary or electoral democracy? How has it worked in practice since then? So for flexibility, yes, the confidence relationship has been flexible, and it's been able to adopt as people have changed their interpretations of how the system works. So one way it's done that is through adopting fixed-term legislation. We have it in Canada. The Ontario government is currently proposing taking it away for the Ontario Parliament, but it fundamentally interferes with how responsible government is supposed to work, because another way to say this is fixed parliaments are something that work really well in a congressional presidential system where you elect a president and Congress separately. But when you elect them together in one, if things aren't working, you do need an early election. So it's sort of an odd thing to force into the system. But we managed it with some interpretation at the federal level that sort of says, oh, fixed-term parliaments should work for majority government to stop the prime minister from abusing the power to request a dissolution, but they don't really apply to minority situations. And then there's been flexibility in terms of interpretation to respond to sort of this electoral democratic pressure. And in the 2015 election, we saw this with all three party leaders coming out and saying, yes, the party with the most seats should form government. And that sort of expressed what many people are thinking, but it is not the way that the traditional idea of responsible government should work, because whoever can hold confidence should be the prime minister. So in that sense, we've seen evolution to reflect more direct democratic interpretations. So let's talk about fluidity. Fluidity also has worked out because of those examples, like the Pearson 2 with the loss of the tax vote, and then the May 2005 Martin 2 defeat. So fluidity has worked out as expected. And this idea of fluidity can also, the way it's been working, and if you look at the way the fluidity played out in sort of public debates in the media at the time, the fluidity works towards, again, this electoral direct connection mindset, and sort of says, you know what, the government, it did have the most, or it does have the most seats in the House of Commons. That means it's more democratically legitimate. And so, yeah, it lost confidence, but let's give it another try, because it should be the one in office. It's what the people selected, so to say. And so we need to give it another chance. That's been the way the discourse has worked. As for midterm government transitions, they haven't really played out, right? There's only been one that has gone, the King Byng situation that resulted in the Mian government in 1926, and we've seen none other since then. And if we look to the discourse in the public discourse around the 2008 parliamentary crisis, it was very clear that there was not a desire to make that midterm transition. And though there were a lot of protests that said, yes, 60% majority voted against the government only represents 40% of the popular vote, at the end of the day, the desire for stability of government and not trusting a coalition, which is necessary for maintaining confidence in situations where you don't have the potential for a majority or a strong single-party minority government, and coalitions are very common in European parliamentary systems, for example. Because there was so much opposition to that, it's pretty much impossible then to have a midterm transition. And so our confidence relationship interpretation of these rules is not lining up with what the rules have traditionally said on paper. And so in other words, we're having this evolution, and the midterm, the difficulty with midterm government transitions is pointing towards change. And so, at the end of the day then, what I'm arguing is that if we think about this chain of delegation and accountability, we still have delegation going on, but accountability is disappearing. And what we're going towards instead is tolerance. So basically, you select the government, and Parliament plays a role in certifying that the government should be the one in office, but it's up to Parliament to then tolerate government for the remainder of the parliamentary term. And if it's not willing to tolerate it, then it's time to go to an early election. But it's breaking that accountability link. And so what you have is these electoral democratic interpretations are disrupting that parliamentary power to hold government accountable. And the interpretation of it is making it less parliamentary in practice. And so it's emphasizing tolerance and representation in terms of who voted for the party that gets the most seats, they'll get the government of their choice, and that representation is emphasized over representation through the whole of the parliament, and that tolerance then through the term outweighs accountability and governance. So to get to my conclusion, so this shift from accountability to tolerance in comparative perspective, the reality is that this isn't really any different than anywhere else. And so that convergence on that big graph I had earlier, all of the parliamentary systems are converging towards similar scores across the confidence relationship that all slightly benefit cabinet relative to parliament. There are also, some countries have adopted these more constructive rules, and the practice of those constructive rules is actually making it more difficult for Parliament to act. So in some sense, our traditional passive confidence relationship makes it a little easier. And all of this is ultimately shifting power away from Parliament and towards this more direct relationship between the electorate and the executive. So that means if we're thinking about this theories of democracy in contention, parliamentary democracy versus electoral democracy, the Canadian rules are making it more difficult to make and break a government because the rules that structure this confidence game limit opportunities for Parliament, and the de facto interpretation is responding to this electoral democracy. And so I have a little representation of this, but if we go back to the chain, basically it's taking the chain and it's turning it into a triangle. So you've got voters, and they're expecting a direct relationship with Parliament to Cabinet, and they're also expecting a direct relationship with Parliament. And so it's going from this direct chain to this triangle. And this triangle is disrupting accountability and going towards tolerance. And I will leave it there.
Thank you so much. As usual, we'll take our break for about 15 or 20 minutes, have coffee, tea, treats, and then we'll come back and have a question and answer session. Hi, sorry to interrupt. We're going to reassemble.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, everyone, we are ready to begin our question and answer, and we'll bring the microphones around as we usually do.
Thank you. A good presentation. Much appreciated. I actually have a couple of questions, and they're kind of related. The first is I'd be interested in your take on how electoral reform, and there are a variety of models, I understand, might affect your analysis and your kind of understanding of this relationship. And then secondly, what impact would that have also on the ability of cabinet, as we understand it right now, to make, I think, what is increasingly necessary in a more complex world, quicker decisions on behalf of the population?
Yep.
Secondly, so impact of electoral reform. Secondly, what if there was an electoral reform and a new model put in place, what would the impact be on cabinet's ability to make decisions more quickly or as quickly as necessary to serve the population?
Okay, so the second question is premised on electoral reform too. Got it. Okay. Electoral reform would probably greatly change the system because it would be so much different than what we currently have, and would force us as a country to confront how we think about coalitions, which are something that mainstream Canadian society doesn't like. Don't like coalitions, don't trust them. And part of that is the accountability thing. When you get to an election and you have a single party government in power, you know who to blame. But when you have a coalition, who do you blame? Usually the junior coalition partner is the one that suffers. That's what the research will say, is that when you, oh, this on wheels. When you get to the next election, people, voters, will remember what the government did, but they'll give that reward to the major party in government, and the junior coalition will suffer. A junior coalition party will suffer. Which is also why when we had the supply and confidence agreement between the Liberals and the NDP under Justin Trudeau's premiership, the NDP had to break it. Because if they looked at the literature, they would see that they were going to get punished for signing that support agreement. And when you get to the next election, that they would probably lose seats because all the benefits like the dental insurance, et cetera, would go to the Liberal government and they wouldn't see that policy benefit. So electoral reform, because if you went from a first past the post system where you just vote for your representative and we don't get a house that reflects the distribution of the popular vote, it's just the distribution of seats. If you switch to proportional representation, we're going to get a much more fragmented House, probably some new, smaller parties. And so that would force more deal-making between parties, and hopefully more accountability in Parliament, but make it more difficult for voters to know who to hold accountable. And so, it would also decrease efficiency because more bargaining between parties will slow down the process, slow down the ability of government to make decisions. And so then, yes, you would have, if you change the electoral system, the argument is that you're going to get a less efficient government. A government that can make decisions quickly will need to get those decisions passed through Parliament, so it's going to slow it down and make it less efficient. Whenever electoral reform debates come up in Canada, that kind of is the narrative. Do we want to have better, more proportional representation with a distribution of parties that represents what people are actually voting for? Or do you want efficiency in government? And also simplicity in the vote, too. That matters a lot in terms of the different electoral systems that are out there and how quickly the ballots can be counted, depending on how many choices you have on the ballot, and how quickly we'll know the results after the fact. So all those things kind of come into play. However, in my 28 case sample that I'm looking at, it includes most of the countries in the sample have proportional representation. So even though they have proportional representation and they have coalition governments, they still have confidence relationships that largely benefit the executive over parliament. So in that sense, in terms of these rules that structure the confidence game, by and large, the rules still work in parliament's benefit, in government's benefit. And part of this is because there's a general valuing of government stability, to keep a government in office for as long as possible, because changing government creates a lot of instability and different policies and who knows. So this is also why, if we go back to the German model, which I keep going back to the German model because it fundamentally changed constitutional design, and a lot of countries followed the German model after the Second World War, or took parts of it. By having a fixed parliamentary term, having a constructive vote of non-confidence, that Parliament needs to say, we're defeating the government, we're going to choose so-and-so to select the leader, that makes it hard to defeat the government, and also government should stay in office for the whole term, this whole parliamentary term, which creates the space, because you have government stability in office, it creates the space for Parliament to not worry about loss of confidence. And then Parliament can spend more time, well, the Bundestag can spend more time actually debating and influencing legislation. So if you want Parliament to do more work than having a more stable government that can't just fall on budget votes, etc., is actually better. So the rationale goes. But that is good influence on policymaking, but the trade-off is that ultimate accountability of being able to toss out the government you don't like is harder. And so you're going to tolerate the government you have and try to influence legislation and policymaking rather than who sits in government itself. I don't know what this is.
Hello. In your speech, and actually that question, I can follow up on that question. You've told us that in Canada, accountability and the confidence rules basically rest on traditional rules, unwritten rules. And that raises, of course, the issue of enforcement. In your address, you haven't mentioned two things that I'm interested in. First of all, the role of partisanship in political parties are in either contributing to or weakening that sense of enforcement of traditional rules, which seem to rest on a sense of the responsible person, the person that feels that these things are so important they must be complied with. The second thing you haven't talked about, and maybe the proroguing issue is relevant, is the head of state, either the Governor General or the Lieutenant Governor. It seems to me that it's a tough case to argue that they are at all a force in enforcement of these rules, all of which seems to suggest that a Trump-like situation is not that difficult to imagine in most governments resting on traditional rules, just because they're so fluid, they're unwritten, and perhaps people don't really care. I want to just comment on enforcement on those two problems, the parties and then the head of state. Thank you.
The enforcement and the people not caring is a major problem for any democracy. And if people don't know how the rules work, then you can't enforce the rules very well. We're entrusting our politicians to enforce the rules if we don't know and debate what the rules are. I mean, that is a reality. But a lot of people face time constraints, busy working, busy trying to get food on the table. And so, yeah, it is hard to follow politics and stay informed. And the bigger the country it is, the harder it is to feel connected. So enforcement can be quite challenging. And then, yes, any system can backslide. There's no perfect system. Partisanship is, in part, baked into all parliamentary systems because of that confidence relationship. We have, another way to say this is that parliaments predate parties. So if you elect representatives to a parliament, and now you have a parliament full of whatever the number, 100 representatives, and they're all going to sit down and they're going to find who holds confidence or whatever, and the government has to maintain confidence of the people's representatives, then the government wants efficiency. The government wants to know that it can maintain that confidence. So there's an incentive built into the system to have political parties, because the government will use incentives to get MPs to support it, and then they'll slowly build up a party, and then you have a party. We also understand parties to be from the grassroots, and to come up, people get together, they have similar policy ideas or ideologies, and they unite to build a party from the grassroots. So parties come from both places, but in a parliamentary system, the logic of responsible government, the logic that government is always responsible on confidence matters in the House of Commons, means that parties will naturally develop. And that's the way it's worked historically in Canada. The parties were much stronger and developed their strength in Parliament first before they went out to the people. Whereas if you look at Europe, parties are some parties have emerged out of the grassroots more. In part because those parties, in large part, emerged in some countries when they were just trying to fight for parliamentary democracy at all, or some sort of democratic system. So they organized first from the grassroots and went up. But here in Canada, we went in large part from Parliament out. So that party discipline is inherent to the system.
Anyway, do you care to speculate on how Carney next week will get a confidence vote for the budget?
The vote will pass. I mean, I don't think anyone has another choice. I think it's quite simple that there's no leader of the NDP. The Conservatives are going to do a leadership review in January. A large part of what's going on within this leadership review process is, can Pierre Poilievre make the changes that he promised, right? And by and large, so forth, since he's come back and Parliament has come back to session and he's come back after his by-election, there hasn't been a significant change in the rhetoric. So my guess would be they too aren't ready for an election, though their coffers are doing better than other parties. So financially, they could go for it. And constitutionally speaking, we can get an early election because, again, circling back to those constitutional conventions, when can you go, what's the role of the Governor General, when can you do an early election? The way the interpretation has worked is now basically, it sort of goes like, Parliament has to have a chance to, after an election, to vote on supply. Government needs to be able to try and supply government. with money. And not just because the party in government wants to finance certain programs, but because you also need to pay for government services so that we don't have a government shutdown, like in the US, where services just stop operating, right? Because we don't, like, parliamentary system, and here in Canada, government, there's always a government, because if there's no government, then you have a monarchy, and so you must always have a prime minister and cabinet to advise the governor general on the exercise of all executive power in the country. So there's always a government. The government might not have confidence, it might be a caretaker, but it's always there. And anyways, it needs to always have a chance to test supply. And so that's what we're getting. We're getting 6 months since the last election, a chance to test supply. If it fails, we probably could go to an early election because of that attempt has been made. Wouldn't be good, but there's special warrants to cover spending shortfalls in the meantime that the Governor General can sign off on. But yeah, constitutionally we can have an early election, but at great risk to the Liberal government. So my argument would be all parties are incentivized to come up with a solution, and even if there's an initial defeat on the budget, confidence is fluid, so they'll get it back within a week.
So back to the question the gentleman touched on earlier about the Governor General. I guess talking about accountability and confidence, I'd say back in the Stephen Harper days when Parliament, I believe I Googled it, was prorogued four times, I'd say I'd lost confidence in the role of the Governor General. And so can you help us understand, would the Governor General ever, like what's the process that role needs to go through or should go through in order to truly make that decision, not just be the yes person for the PM?
The Governor General has to be the yes person for the PM unless the Constitution is broken. Like, as in, the Prime Minister doesn't want to resign from office. Confidence has been lost, and the Prime Minister says, no, I'm staying on anyways. And they try again to regain confidence, they still lose again. No, refuse to resign. At that point, the Governor General could step in and say, no, this is now violating the Constitution. You no longer have confidence of the House, you can't remain in office. The same thing if 2008 had played out a little bit different and there hadn't been prorogation and the non-confidence vote had gotten voted on, and now confidence has been lost, government can't regain. You have a coalition government who has, coalition of two parties that has sent a public letter saying that they plan to form government. But then Mr. Harper goes to the Governor General, Michel Jean, and says, you know what, I'd like to have a dissolution, because this is not representing the will of the people to have this coalition. Then the Governor General would have been within her right to say, no, that violates the Constitution, you can't do it. But until there's a violation of constitutional practice, the Governor General is always going to be a yes person, because to do otherwise would to violate the democratic principles of our Constitution and the fact that it's a constitutional monarchy.
Thank you for your presentation, particularly your last slide, because I'm one of these. And on your graph, I'm a voter, and I view democracy as the will of the people. And what you have described and have lectured on is a parliamentary system that is based on rules, and it's a process. But I talked with Adam Chambers here, and the world goes around based on power and self-interest. We vote based on our self-interest. We have climate change. We have all the problems in the world are ours because we voted for them. But it was power that managed the process. So I look at the US, which is in a mess, but I get Facebook pages that says the Republican Party is now actively trying to change the rules in swing states such that it's possible for Trump to run for a third term. So would you define what's happening in the US as democracy?
The U.S. is by no means my area of expertise. As a presidential congressional system, it is not an area that I spend a lot of time thinking about because I generally research parliamentary regimes. But by and large, despite not having a king, the president as an office is set up to be an elected king in the way the Constitution works. So an elected king with an 8-year term max. But when you add in I'm forgetting, the Electoral College, right? You add into the Electoral College into this mix, right? The whole Constitution was constructed originally on the premise of concern over mob rule and concern over, you needed to have an Electoral College to sort of control what the people chose when they elected the president. So from the very beginning, the Constitution has always been concerned with the possibility for mob rule and having some sort of superior and more educated check on the democratic process in the United States. It also is based on separation of power, of which the way parliamentary systems are usually framed, it's a little bit more towards this fusion of power because the executive is selected out of parliament, so there's a blending between parliament and legislature, whereas the US system has an executive, the president, head of the executive, elected separately from the people, so that's the executive, and then you have Congress elected separately, so it's supposed to be separate, and then the courts operate separate. And that idea of separation, you could trace back almost to pre-parliamentary or parliamentary democracies and monarchical systems, where you would have a king and you had a parliament, but parliament had a difficult time controlling the king, other than to restrict, and I'm talking about the UK here. So under England, before the UK, parliament was being asked to vote on budget legislation, to give money to the king, whether the king could, use tax monies to pay for things. And so Parliament and the king, two separate, they had separation of powers, were always butting heads. And this idea of separation of powers, I guess what I'm trying to say, was something that happened in pre-parliamentary democracy England, and the Americans turned that into their constitution. And they kept that separation of powers. Whereas a parliamentary system has blended them, which also means that there's different layers of accountability along the way.
Thank you. Just wondering is there a democratic country in the world, in your opinion, that has done it fairly well, or has any, the number of imperfections are less than others, or if so, what are the factors that would make it better? Why are those countries better than, say, our own, or is there no democratic country that has kind of achieved perfection?
Yeah, whether a country has done it better is a hard one to answer because it would require you to define what better means. and what thing in the parliamentary system you want to emphasize. And when you've decided what that thing is, then you can design the system to emphasize it. So I don't entirely have an answer for you. I can tell you there are certain systems that just aren't good in the way that they're working, because they just aren't giving Parliament any real say in the matter. Or they've built so many different rules into the use of any of their confidence testing mechanisms that it's very difficult to use any of them to hold the government accountable. So then that could be quite troublesome. Malta can function that way sometimes. Bulgaria has a lot of additional rules that make it quite complicated and hard to act. In terms of who performs very well, it's hard to know, but by and large, size matters. So, because we want to feel connected to the process, and the larger the polity is in both geographic and numbers, the harder it is to feel attached to it and feel like the rules really represent and the results represent what you're interested in. So if you start to look at any of the indices out there in the world ranking parliamentary systems or whatever, democratic systems generally, and look at satisfaction with parliamentary systems, the countries with smaller populations will be the happier ones, by and large, because they have more stake and they can see their direct connection. So in that sense, I would say probably those systems are also doing it better. Usually New Zealand will get thrown out as one of those as well. I mean, what they've done, because they also have the same basic Westminster model to what we've done, they've added in mixed member proportional representation and cabinet, in part, well, not just cabinet. When they switched the electoral system from first past the post to mixed member proportional, so now people would have 2 ballots. They would vote both for a constituency representative, just like we do, and then you vote for a party choice. And so using that, you can distribute, there's like not all the seats in the parliament are for constituencies, some are for party choices. So you would distribute all the constituency seats and then distribute extra seats to parties to ensure that the number of seats each party has in Parliament is roughly equal to their proportion of the popular vote based on this party vote. So they get then a roughly proportional system, but there was a lot of concern, just like we have. What about coalitions? What about parliamentary instability? What's going to happen when after the election? How are we going to get a government? And so the Governor General went on a study tour all through Europe, and then they went on Governor General Hardy Boys also did a lot of speeches leading up and then also after the election, and spelled out for the New Zealand public how it would work, what were the constitutional rules, whatever. And so all of those speeches then got turned into, there are cabinet manuals that say what the internal workings of cabinets are. Canada has one too, but they're generally and have historically been kept secret. In Canada, one enterprising student, former MA student, did a access to information request to get to the Canadian one. And now the caretaker convention and some other get publicized. Anyways, in the UK, in New Zealand, because of this concern about what would happen with MMP, they added it all to the cabinet manual, and then they released the cabinet manual publicly. So they kept the same flexible rule system, but they wrote it down in a way that was accessible and people could then look up and know the rules. Having said all of that, they don't do a lot of non-confidence votes and such either, in part because they have 3-year parliamentary terms. So with even more frequent elections, there's a sense of, well, should we defeat the government at all when the election is in another year anyways? And And so that decreases the likelihood of early elections, the fact that they're constitutionally required every 3 years, whereas here it's constitutionally required every 5. So that makes a difference too.
In your remarks, you commented that our parliament is relatively passive and their job now is to be tolerant. I wonder how you could fit in the phenomenon of the party in power ousting their own leader and how that fits into the idea of accountability.
So you're asking whether the party in power can oust their own leader? So the parliamentary party can't do that, but the party at large can, because we have switched the way we select party leaders. Traditionally, it was all about the parliamentary party. The parliamentary party would, like all the MPs in parliament for a particular party, would select the leader. And that still, and those parliamentary members of the party would also be able to get rid of the leader. And that's also why you see so many leadership changes in Australia. If you're following Australian politics, the party is always ditching the leader and getting a new one. But starting in 1919 in the Liberal Party, they decided to follow the American election, direct election of all party membership. Well, it was delegated, but anyways, having this direct election of party membership for a leader of the party. And so now, in order to get rid of a leader, you have to then involve the party. In some way, the party beyond Parliament. And yeah, I mean, there's the democracy that we have, that is the democracy of going to vote for your MPs, to select a parliament, to select government. And then there's intra-party democracy, the party that happens internally within parties. And that is not a matter of the Constitution. That is completely up to the parties and the way they write their own constitutions. I guess what I'm trying to say is parties are private enterprises and they're beyond our constitutional structure in that sense. How they decide to conduct their affairs is how they conduct their affairs. It does lead, in a sense, to a midterm transition of government, in the sense that you're going from one prime minister to another prime minister. But in terms of really changing where confidence lies, it's still within that same cabinet structure. It's still within that same party. And so in terms of thinking about it, has Parliament had a role to play in holding that government accountable and leading to a new prime minister? It's lesser than that. Like, it's less direct. And so it doesn't really count then in that sense of Parliament being able to hold the government accountable. Did that kind of get where your question was going? Okay.
It's on. Hi. You mentioned about the Prime Minister's office is not, excuse me, is not mentioned in the Constitution. Do you feel that the Prime Minister's office has, over time, taken on more powers than it should have originally, or was there one particular Prime Minister that abrogated more powers, or was it a kind of an evolution, or am I sort of talking up my sleeve here?
So my first question to you is: do you mean the do you mean the Prime Minister as an office,
yes,
or the office of the Prime Minister? Because there's the office, like the staff that work.
Oh, yeah, the Prime Minister's office, PMO.
So the staff, or the person of the Prime Minister.
The person.
Okay.
The person, sorry.
Yeah. it's a frequent confusion, you know, because they're the same name, right? But they're different things. Has the power of the office of the Prime Minister increased? That's right. Thanks. The office of the Prime Minister, so the person of the Prime Minister's power increased when we switched to direct election of party leaders. Because now the Prime Minister can say, I have a mandate from all the people in my party. And so the parliamentary party can't get rid of me because I've got this direct electoral mandate. And so they're pitted against each other. When there wasn't that direct selection, if the parliamentary party was unhappy with what the party leader as Prime Minister was doing, they could remove them from office. And so in that sense, I would argue that switch in how we select party leaders has had a significant impact on party leaders in general becoming more powerful, and then party leaders who are prime ministers have also become more powerful as well. And in general, party leaders have become more powerful. In part also, there's the direct selection, but there's also changes to the Elections Act, like the changes in 1974, where now candidates had to have their party's name on the ballot. And making that change then empowered the party leader to not give that permission to local candidates running. And so that's also how you get party leaders saying, no, we don't like what that electoral district association has selected as their candidate. We want so-and-so instead, because they can deny the name. So in general, we've been empowering party leaders in all the parties, and that in turn also empowers the Prime Minister, who's able to join both together.
So Elsa, I want to say thank you so much. This has been very interesting. You have shared an incredible depth of knowledge in your research on the parliamentary democracy and confidence relationships. We have really appreciated your in-depth responses to our questions, and I think it has helped us to further understand our Canadian democratic system. So thank you so much. I'm sure we could keep you here a lot longer, but it's noon, so we have to go. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And for everyone else, please watch your email for the winter series coming up. Thank you for being here.